Hi, I'm Dennis Weiss. Welcome to Why Like Ike. We're in our favorite place. We got our favorite gloves. We got Tim Rives. I can't really call him a favorite, but he's pretty darn good. How are you this morning?
Fine, Dennis. Glad you're back.
And we have our favorite subject, Dwight David Eisenhower, and we're going to do education today. We're going to talk about education. We're going to educate the public. We're going to give everybody a chance to learn some things about Dwight David Eisenhower. It's going to be fun.
And that story began really not even quite a football field from where we're sitting this morning at Lincoln School, now the site of our visitor center where Ike began in first grade, I believe.
Cool.
And from the beginning of his educational life, you can see the interest in things that led to his success as a military commander and then later as president.
Very cool. You know, we film in Abilene because this is the home of Dwight David Eisenhower, his library, his museum, his boyhood home, and his history.
It really
his
did
life.
Begin on this
Okay,
spot.
so we have a brand new school in Abilene, and it's named after Dwight David Eisenhower. Right. So it's very appropriate to the viewers. Ike has been in front of them quite a lot the last couple of years in the public, in the newspaper, on television.
He really has.
The name, the topic. And you and I get to say this many times, but you know, 186,000 or thereabout people walk through these doors every year, and the significance of that number cannot be overstated to Abilene.
It really can't. I mean, given the size of our community of 6,800, that's a lot of visitors.
So the purpose of this show, Why Like Ike, is to tell people things they may not know and give them a little peek of interest to some artifacts so they can come here, ask questions, do a little research, have some fun, bring a family from Wisconsin, whatever it takes, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And again, it's probably not well known that he began school where our visitor center is now.
I didn't know that.
Lincoln Elementary, as it was called. Unfortunately, the school he attended was long gone by the time he became well enough known to have tried to preserve it. You know, but from the beginning, there was the interest in history, military history, biography, as well as the talent that he always showed for mathematics and any sort of logical thinking. Ike really excelled at that. And you could see it, you know, from his earliest report cards. And he also talked about other lessons he learned. The one I usually recall is that he discovered with schoolyard bullies that it was better to take a beating than to live constantly in fear. And so that became one of his, I guess, guiding principles in his military and political career. But you really can see, you know, the man who grows out of that boy here in Abilene. Eisenhower, you know, loved football and baseball, and they actually played baseball where the parking lot is for the visitor center. So it all, you know, occurred right where we are today.
And still today, this campus is site for a historic baseball game every year. They go back in time and put on an authentic baseball game. And over and over again, these programs are a reminder to people that preserving the legacy of Dwight David Eisenhower has value for the world.
That's right.
We see researchers come from all over the world, and they spend time here, and they take knowledge out of here, and they use it to sum up their thoughts about a particular topic. And we see that often, and maybe we're a little bit used to it, but you know, the thought is that people come from all over the world because the legacy of Dwight David Eisenhower is of value to them.
That's right. So, I mean, Eisenhower and Abilene both have an effect on the world that's way out of proportion to our size. That's certainly important.
Okay, we started school right over there.
Yeah.
Lincoln Elementary, and
then on to Garfield Middle School, north end of town.
Just closed.
Which just closed, yeah. I don't think it was the same
has a
building,
new future, maybe? I mean, there are development things going on around that name and that site. And
well,
so
maybe a second life for it then.
Yeah, very good.
And then Abilene High School, which I think we've covered before, so I thought today maybe a little more about the military education.
Okay. Well, on the picture board behind us, if I'm not mistaken, we have both West Point and Fort Leavenworth.
We do, both of which, of course, were his success there was critical to what he became. And I think, as we've probably discussed before, he really didn't have a military career in mind. You know, even though he enjoyed military history as a boy, his goal was to get an education, get a college education, and also continue playing sports if he could. And he discovered, really after high school, from a friend of his named Sweet Hazlitt, that the service academies offered a free education. And so, to make that story a little shorter than it really is, he eventually won the appointment to West Point and left Abilene in 1911, you know, in pursuit of that education. Graduated 61st out of a class of 164. He was admittedly, kind of an indifferent student. His rank in his comportment for discipline was 125th out of 164. And again, it's funny to read the demerits list. It's for being late to formation. It's for not having a button polished. It's for leaving a pair of trousers, over his chair, when they're at class, that kind of thing. But he didn't really take that part of it very seriously. Again, it was more about the education, the chance to participate in sports. We do have some of his books from West Point, this officer's manual, and I don't know how many of these are a good example for what I'd like to illustrate, but Eisenhower was a very engaged reader, and so there'd often be, marginalia or heavy underlining in the books, but this was, as you can see, Dwight D. Eisenhower, D.D. Eisenhower, Abilene, Kansas, West Point, New York, 1911. So this was actually probably one of the first books issued to him when he went to West Point.
Fantastic.
It doesn't look heavily used, but
well, I had a few books in college that the binders were perfect on.
That's right. And we're fortunate that we have, of course, as many as we do, because who knew in 1911 or 1912 what he would become? And so here, the elements of law, of military law that Eisenhower studied, and this one's dated 1912. And it's also interesting that he has his name in here 3 times, and each one's a little different, so you wonder perhaps if he was practicing his signature. And what's interesting to me, this bottom one, the Eisen with the break between the Hauer,
I see that,
is how he really signed his name the rest of his life.
Is that right?
Yeah, always had that break, and that's...
Maybe that's where he created that.
That's right.
thought.
He was born and studied military law and worked on his signature.
That picture of that book is a great example of what you do here, what all of you do here. We couldn't discuss that point if we couldn't see it.
It does help, and of course just this huge context of artifacts and textual holdings that we could put these sort of things in, maybe to understand them a little better. Like that signature. If we hadn't seen literally tens of thousands of variations of that signature, you might not notice something like that. So that is a really fun part of our job.
So I had a thought during your talk about his time at West Point and 65th and those sorts of things. I can't take credit for this quote. It's Chuck Swindoll quote, but he says this often. I've heard it many times. He said, when God has an impossible task, he takes an impossible man and breaks him and remakes him for the task he wants done. So in that thought, you look at the man that Dwight David Eisenhower became. He became that man because of Lincoln School, all the way through his childhood, including his ranking, including his demerits, including all of those facts in his life, formed the man that we know that stands in bronze out in the middle of the courtyard here.
Yeah, and the real breaking, of course, occurred when they lost their firstborn son, Ike, who died when he was just a little over 3 years old. And that was a turning point in Ike's life. And shortly thereafter, they went to Panama in January of 1922, where he served under a guy named Fox Connor. And Fox Connor was considered the Army's leading intellectual and teacher. And he put Ike on a really strenuous reading and book discussion program. And in fact, one thing that so many Eisenhower scholars have tried to do, and that we've tried to do over the years, is compile a bibliography of some of those books he read under Connor's tutelage. And I've identified, probably 20 or 30, and a lot of them are classics of war, like, von Clausewitz, On War, which is this thick tome written by a Prussian officer. Eisenhower said he had to read it 3 times in order to understand it. A guy named Kenneth Davis wrote the first serious Eisenhower biography called Soldier of Democracy in 1945, and he was from K-State, and his interview notes are over there. And even though it doesn't appear in his book, he notes in his own notes that a copy of Clausewitz's On War was on Ike's table out in the field in 1944 in France.
Really?
So you could see him dipping back into that well of knowledge, I suppose, for advice or inspiration or guidance. Another, Eisenhower really liked Arthur Conan Doyle, but it wasn't so much Sherlock Holmes. It was a couple of medieval novels that he wrote, Sir Nigel and the White Company, and then the Adventures of Brigadier Gerard, who was in the Napoleonic Wars. And what's interesting, there is a picture of Ike. He became the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, the first Supreme Allied Commander. And that's where this picture is from. And I know it's difficult to see, But in the foreground of his desk is the collected stories of Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh, really?
So
Very
again,
cool.
he's going back to these books that he read under Connor, you know, in that kind of critical time in 1922. Connor then is also instrumental in getting him into the Command and General Staff College up the road from us in Leavenworth. And that is like one of the watershed sort of moments in the life of a career officer. And depending upon how well you do at Leavenworth kind of determines the rest of your career. He studied, you know, very diligently both before he got there and then at West Point. As we discussed earlier, his good friend George Patton gave him his notes from when he was in the course the year before. And so again, Eisenhower realized how important it was and graduated first in his class of 245 in 1926. And we have, among, of course, our many artifacts and textual records, we have Eisenhower's diploma from the Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth.
That's very cool. You know, as we just discussed, his ranking at West Point and then his later collegiate studies of war at the War College and the differences thereof, right? Everybody makes a decision. You make decisions as you go through life, and Eisenhower is just a person like all the rest of us are. But that one had to be a very deliberate decision. If I'm going to succeed in what I have chosen for a career, your ranking at the Command College is important.
He knew what it meant. And it led then to a job under General Pershing at the American Battle Monuments Commission, where he was then assigned to write 2 guidebooks to the American battle monuments and cemeteries in Europe, and produced one edition that came out in the late 20s, and then another revised edition that came out in the late 30s. And what's interesting about this later edition is he did not get along with his commander, a guy named Xenophon Price, who then left Ike's name out of this book that he wrote when it was published in 1939, so perhaps a little petty. But then, you know, this experience led him back to Washington, where he became the assistant to the Assistant Secretary of War, and allowed him then to go to the Army War College, which is another Army postgraduate school in Washington, D.C., where you're learning how to command at even higher levels. So that was another step in his career. And we have some books also from that time period. This one's another manual of court martials, not just military law, but court martials. And Eisenhower was quite the doodler, and you can see an arrow pointing up on this, and maybe that's some subconscious sign of ambition or something.
We'll try to get some close-ups after we're done filming, and so people can get a quick look at that. Hey, let's take a quick break in the middle. Is that all right for you?
That's all right with me.
We'll take a quick break, and we'll come back with Why Like Ike, and we'll continue on this discussion about Eisenhower and education. We'll be right back.
Around here, we believe in local values like hard work, family time, or a fair price on reliable internet from a local company. That's why Eagle Communications delivers great local values, like a range of internet options to fit your family's needs. Fast and consistent enough to power everyone's devices at once. All at reasonable prices we're proud to offer our friends and neighbors. Ready for better internet? Give us a call or visit eaglecom.net and discover our local values today.
Dennis Weiss and Tim Rives back talking about Dwight David Eisenhower and education. And of course, with anything Eisenhower, there is no end to the material you can talk about.
There's really
any subject. So today it's education. You told us that Ike's a doodler, and you're showing us this book with a little arrow doodled on it. It's a very nice arrow. Very nice and straight, symmetrical. I'll also point out he filled in the O's.
He did. He filled in all the vowels.
I do that
there,
myself.
Yeah.
It's compulsive.
And then there's a helmet with camouflage, which is kind of interesting, in color even.
Yeah.
So, oh, and then we have on the back, let's see, here's a I-beam from several different angles, and then a profile, perhaps maybe of one of his instructors.
And because we did this show last year, what did he take up? Was a hobby afterwards, his presidency?
Oh, painting.
Yes. So he's practicing there. See,
I didn't pick up on that clue.
That's okay. I knew you'd get it.
No, and it's interesting. You see his notes as both a military officer and as president, and as he was thinking, he would doodle, and often very abstract shapes, which is interesting. And I get, it does give you probably some insight to the way he thought or the way that he liked to think things out. And even making important decisions like whether to send troops into Little Rock in 1957, there are some doodles on those pages too.
Is that right?
So,
but I just discuss these things because it's interesting to me. As I looked at the doodling there, all the lines are nearly perfectly straight. Even on the profile, the lines are just crisp. What that means, I don't know, but the reality of it is it's interesting to my mind to look at that and go, I couldn't do that with a ruler. I really couldn't.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think just the precision that Eisenhower was known for, the clarity of his thought, his ability as a really linear, logical thinker. That's probably what's being expressed in some of those doodles. Another book from Leavenworth. Not as many comments on this one.
The title of that one, Military Aid to the Civil
Power.
Isn't that kind of significant about the man who brought restoration to war? We filmed a couple of shows and talked a little bit about that over the years, but I think I said this early on with Carl Weisenbach in one of the interviews in the office years and years ago. To me, the overwhelming thought about Eisenhower has always been that he was the first commander of war to go in and rebuild the enemy in a scale that lasted forever. So the rebuilding of Europe, the displaced persons, all of that. Eisenhower, that was the genesis of a different thought process about war. Was to immediately start building the peace.
Well, he always had that foresight of what's the next step after the war. What next? And so that was one of his talents.
So we're talking about education, and you said this is a book, and that's why I thought it was significant. So I'm going to let Brian shoot the title of it again, because that's the thought I had, right? So you go to school to learn what to do. Maybe this book, which is here at this library, is a place that formed a thought process that he used to face the task of ending the war in Europe and rebuilding that area of the world so humans could prosper there again.
Well, and as we've seen in a couple examples, he would go back to those books again and again and again. So these books very well, could have influenced some of those decisions.
Yeah. We have had the pleasure of filming in the archives when in the front room of the research room after the students were there, and we talked about the sophomores come in every year. Well, so the link from Eisenhower to education is going on here every year in lots of ways. I think I repeat this on TV all the time, and because you never know who's watching, new viewer. The value of having this material is for the learning of future generations, and the value of that cannot be numerically stated.
No, there are so many lessons. And we educate so many thousands of students every year, and we'll never get through an entire curriculum of what there is to learn from Dwight Eisenhower. Yeah. But there's always something new. His education continued after that Army War College. There's the Army Industrial School, where he studied resource mobilization and just supply chain management. And it's also, he said, where he learned early on about the military-industrial complex. He got this first glimpse of that whole structure. And that school is now named the Dwight D. Eisenhower School for Resource Mobilization.
Really very cool.
In honor of their most famous graduate.
My son reminds me of this all the time. He's a history buff, and so this place to him is the treasures of the world are here. So he reminds me all the time that we won World War II because of our logistics and resupply, not by technical superiority of any weapon system we had, and he goes on to point out all the intricate details of that. But the fact is, you said, education, Eisenhower, logistics, resupply, that's how we won the war.
Well, as Mamie said, at that industrial school, Ike learned how many man-hours it took to make everything from a mess kit to a bomber. And so he really had an appreciation of what the U.S. industry could produce in terms of what he needed on the battlefield. So again, just another one of those examples of how critical these early experiences are to what he became. So that was the end of his formal military education, the Army Industrial College. But then he establishes, when he's Army Chief of Staff and the first, at least de facto chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National War College, which was to integrate the staffs of both the Army, the Navy, the new Air Force into one integrated command, which he had that experience, of course, as a Supreme Commander during World War II. And then when he goes to NATO, he establishes the NATO Defense College, which is to do that cooperation again at an international level. And so he not just benefited from all these years of military education, he created 2 schools that still exist and are important today.
I think that's significant to our topic today because men of great power have many choices that they can use power on. And what Eisenhower showed us, I think, is his value of education, because that's what he used his power to create, is the ability for other people to learn, other people to acquire knowledge, other people to be able to practice the use of it. Was important to him, or he wouldn't have done that. He was President of the United States.
And you go back to his memoirs and he talks about how his parents emphasized education from the very beginning for a way for all those boys to advance. So here he did it as a student, and then he did it as an instructor, where he also taught at the Army Industrial College or School, and then creating 2 schools of his own. So you could see a very long line there of steps he took to improve education.
We filmed, I think, a couple of versions ago and talked about Eisenhower's frustration with not being in World War I. And Camp Colt, right? Yes, I'm looking, yep, Camp Colt. So at Camp Colt, he was training people how to run tanks, and he had no tanks.
Right.
And that was frustrating for him. But he did it so well.
He did it. Yeah.
That it drew the attention of people who then moved him through the command structure to where he became in World War II. So young people out there, you never know where today's lesson will take you, but your opportunity to either do it well or not do it well is a choice you need to take seriously.
And not going overseas to France, which he considered a failure, he then said to a friend, from now on I'm determined to cut as wide a swath as I can so that no one will ever doubt my ability again. Yeah. And that's that motivation then again with being Fox Connor in Panama and being #1 in his class at Leavenworth. You can see how that played into his future as well.
He certainly cut a wide swath.
Indeed.
So here we are. We got about 2 to 3 minutes left, I'm guessing. And as our topic today was education, I don't know of a mission that's maybe more important for the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home to occupy the land on, is to promote the educational outreach to tomorrow's generation, to my grandchildren. The good news is you do that well. We as a community do that well. The school, the community itself partner in, people give money to that cause. So we as a community do it well. But as we look about the things that are important about Eisenhower's legacy here, today's topic is #1 on my list. It's that we have a chance to share the wisdom of the past with the generation of the future. We can do it in the exhibits, we can do it in the library research room, and we can do it through that camera.
Well, you're right. Everything we do here in the large sense is education, whether it's museum exhibits, public programs, or even the research in the library. It's all part of that wider education mission.
So what's the funnest thing as we wrap up? You said before the camera come on, nobody has any idea about how fun you are. So what is the funnest thing that you found to prepare for this filming today, Tim Rives?
I didn't bring it with me.
Okay, you had it. What is it?
But Eisenhower had this habit, you can see it in his diaries as an adult, he would rate his superiors, he would rate his colleagues. There are some textbooks from grammar school, and he is rating his teachers by their temperament and by their teaching ability. And so that's another one of those traits you can see that his entire life. You followed him from Abilene through his entire career.
That is cool. Any leader has to be able to rank and sort his people.
That's right, yeah. And he did from the time he was 6 years old, apparently.
Yeah, well, that is cool. All right. Always something, it's always fun for me to ask those questions because there's always an answer. Because Eisenhower is so full, his life on display, what we know about it, what we're still learning about it every day, what 186,000 people a year come see, what you're still setting research records every year.
We are indeed.
So all those researchers coming in, what they then expose back to the world. I remember being in the office doing one of these filmings, and you came rushing in just before the camera came on. You said, "Carl, I can't be here. The White House called. I've got to go."
We do get those calls from time to time.
So you know, how relevant is that?
Very relevant.
Very
Eisenhower's still
relevant.
very relevant.
So excited to be with you today.
Thank
Glad
you,
we
Dennis.
had the opportunity to talk about education. That's so fun for us to put on media so people can watch it both on television, YouTube, and all the other places that people post this thing on Facebook and goes all over the world. I had fun today.
Me too. Thank you.
All right, Tim Rives, Dennis Weiss. I work for Eagle Communication. Tim works here, and he works for you. You have a great day.